Hi folks, and welcome back to World Wildlife Journeys. Today I've come through to Cape Town to drop off my daughter, so I'm on the road, but I'm joined by Dr. Mike Musgrave, who is himself in France, and Mike is a PhD, and he's a lecturer at a new college that's been opened in Kigali, Rwanda, that is looking at mentoring African leaders in the field of conservation. He's a fascinating guy to talk to with some, I got to warn you up front, some pretty controversial ideas. But Mike, thanks very much for joining us, taking the time to chat to us, and welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Russell. Good to see you again, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, fantastic. Just tell us a little bit about where you're currently working and the project that you're involved with in Kigali, because this is a really fascinating thing.
Yeah, it's, I'm a faculty member of the School of Wildlife Conservation at the African Leadership University. So this is a new university that's been set up by a very dynamic, motivated Ghanaian guy called Fred Swaneker. Just Google him, he's all over YouTube. And his criticism of the problems in Africa is that we're poorly led. Our leaders failed us and have done over the last 50 years. And so he set up an institution to train several million African leaders over the next 20 years. And interestingly, it has identified wildlife conservation as one of the great opportunities for Africa. We've got what other countries have lost. We've got what other countries are trying to get back to with various rewilding schemes. And it can be a source of great wealth, and it can be a source of jobs, income, business for African people. And so every student, whether they're studying business or computer science or entrepreneurship, they all get a taste of wildlife conservation along their journey. Hopefully, they emerge as the new leaders that the continent desperately needs.
And that sounds like an incredible initiative. And you were on your way to Kigali when COVID interrupted your travels. So I have sympathy for that, seeing as I've been at home for about a year now as well. Tell us, in terms of the current paradigm of conservation and wildlife in Africa, you and I have discussed this, and there's basically a fairly strong body of evidence that suggests that the way that we've been doing things, kind of business as normal, has really not worked. Everywhere you look around the continent, numbers of wildlife are plunging. And the problem is not going away anytime soon. Your position is that the only way that we address this really is with a paradigm shift. We need to throw away all of our kind of preconceived notions and deal with the hard, cold facts in front of us. A prime example being that perhaps looking at wildlife as something that we can farm. If there's a demand for various wildlife products, then why not, if there's a demand for zebra skins, why not farm zebras? I mean, we farm cows, we farm pigs. Why do we have this mental block about taking a wild animal, domesticating it, and breeding it and growing it in order to supply the demand that's there? Is that fair to say that that's something that you believe in?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this idea of a paradigm shift, again, I speak with a broad brush here. There's some successes here and there, but by and large, just look at the numbers. Yeah. It's not me making this assertion. Just look at the numbers. Look what's happened to wildlife across Africa in the last 30 years. It is a total and utter failure. And there are pockets of success, but when we look at those pockets of success, they point us to where we should be going. You take a country like South Africa, which, really is not an ideal wildlife range state. It's a highly developed country, fenced off across the length and breadth of it. South Africa has 20 times the wildlife that it had 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Then look at a country like Kenya, which is much more suited for wildlife, really, in terms of being a huge open country where wildlife potentially could just roam across its ancient migration routes. Kenya's lost 85% of its wildlife in the last 30 years, 40 years. So what's going on there? And it comes down to this quiet revolution in conservation terms. People don't really talk about it very much. I mean, you and I know this, but it's about attaching value to wildlife. It's about attaching value that makes people want to keep it around, want to have it around, want to farm it, want to ranch it, want to have it even just wild and wandering around on the farm. And so the South African and to a large extent Namibian stories point us in the direction that we need to be going.
That's really interesting.
And this doesn't suit, a lot of the romantics who would like to go back to, 1800, where wildlife wandered free and wild across the continent. Well, that's a nice idea, but actually, if you want wildlife around, you've got to do what make it works in the modern world. That's the reality.
So, just playing devil's advocate here, would you say, the one thing that I think the kind of 1820s vision of preserving huge swaths of land intact is that one of the arguments that's been made against the South African model is that because the guys are focusing on return on investment and how many zebras can I pack into this place, then you're not getting that blanket preservation of a cross section of species. So in other words, it doesn't really address the issue of biodiversity per se. So
I would say, well, what's the alternative? Because we can see what the alternative is. The alternative is nothing. And so it does need to go beyond the South African model. And the South African model just wouldn't work in many African countries. We're not proposing fencing or, land to breed hundreds of zebra or whatever we like, or whatever the market particularly wants at any one time. It goes beyond the valuation only of the animals, and it turns to the valuation of biodiversity itself. And so it's early days, but there are now, for the first time, strong moves at a very high level globally to place value on ecosystem function. We now don't have to make the argument anymore that ecosystems underpin our wealth. They underpin everything we do. And slowly we now are starting to develop the accounting systems and the valuation techniques to say, right, biodiversity is valuable, carbon capture by forests needs a value on it, and wildlife contributes to the functioning of ecosystems, and so it's that kind of broader valuation that needs to come into play.
I've always said that when it comes to kind of these initiatives of, we're the traditional development model, we would always very accurately measure, how much a road into this area would add to the GDP over time. The thing that we were extremely naive about was the fact that the ecological inputs in terms of water, air, biodiversity, what those costs were never measured. They were never built in. They were just assumed that, free air, free water, free. As soon as you start costing in those things, I mean, I always use the example of the road that they wanted to put through in northern Tanzania to just say, this is insane, because the entire development metric misses the value of an intact wildebeest migration in 100 years' time, which is just, you know, it's impossible to even put a number on that because it would be so valuable, compared to, you know, a couple of GDP points because, you know, the fishermen in Lake Victoria have an easier access to the markets of Arusha. It's just nonsensical.
Yeah, to be fair, we haven't had the accounting systems that are able to handle that. You know, we haven't had the systems of valuation that would be accepted by a
but this is the paradigm shift that you're talking about.
Absolutely.
This is the kind of work that you're at the cutting edge of, is to say we need to come up with a methodology to actually accurately measure this stuff so that we can put a value on it.
That's exactly right. So this is about the banks accepting environmental costs on the balance sheet. You know, to be fair to those developers of that road, if they'd gone back to the bank who was funding that project and said, oh, by the way, there's an estimated biodiversity cost of $20 million on the road, the banks would have laughed at them. What are you talking about, biodiversity costs? Just build the road. So it really needs to be integrated into the financial system, our international accounting standards, in order for it to become mainstream. But for the first time in the last, I guess, just the last year, and perhaps because of COVID, this is now being recognized at a very high level and being pushed on an international basis.
Yeah, and that's a very positive initiative. Now, you and I were talking about another idea that you've come up with, another one of Dr. Mike's brainchilds, about actually incentivizing African leaders once they leave office with a grant or a gratuity that measures their performance while in office on a kind of environmental scorecard, so that they are kind of incentivized to figure that into their calculations. Tell us a little bit more about that idea.
So when I look at the conservation efforts where money gets spent, and it's a lot of money, it's hundreds of millions of dollars, it gets spent on research. It gets spent on, you know, yet another project to conserve this or save that, or you know, motivated by the best of intentions. But you know, you've got to look back. You know, let's look back 30 years, 40 years. You know, our lifetimes. Sorry to give your age away there, Russell, but you know, you and I have lived through the elimination of rhino in the Luangwa and Zambezi Valley.
Yep.
There are areas in Zambia where I used to do a lot of work that have gone from cathedral Brachystegia woodland to an utter wasteland with not a single tree left. What research, if you could go back 30 years and do it differently, what research is going to change that, would have changed that? And the answer is nothing. You're not going to conserve a species by doing more research on it. There's nothing we can find out about lions or elephants or rhino that's going to save them. So what is? It's policy. Okay, it's politics. This is the root of the problem. And so, you know, my idea was, well, you know, let's talk to the politicians then. And how do you talk to politicians? Well, what do they love more than anything else? Money. So we set up an organization.
I can literally hear people squirming when you address this at a conference. The discomfort is palpable.
Absolutely. So my proposal is we set up an organization that rewards African presidents when they retire with $5 million. But at the same time, this organization doesn't just hand out money. We monitor on a continent-wide basis the state of the conservation sector, the state of wildlife. And there are many, many metrics that we need to develop and use. You know, numbers of elephants, numbers of lions, that can be one metric, but we need to, you know, look at deforestation. we need to include human values. What are people's livelihoods looking like? Are people able to use the natural resources on their doorstep, the mushrooms, the berries, the small antelope that they catch for food? Are those in abundance? Are we managing our habitats so that rural people can enjoy the fruits of their environment? So we could develop a whole lot of metrics and then compare, on a comparable basis across the continent. That alone would be a useful exercise. But then the headline catcher, the headline event would be, at the retirement of every African president, we will say, well, we measured the situation when you came into power, and actually you've done a really good job, because we can show that by the time you left power, elephant numbers increased by 40%, deforestation went down by 10%. Thanks very much. Well done. Here's $5 million.
And I'm just thinking about this. The genius of this idea is that you could actually publish that metric in real time. So they would be getting a potential, and it's something that could become a very powerful weapon for influencing policy. If they announce, for example, we're going to put in a road from A to B, as we were discussing the road that was possibly going to be put through the middle of the migration in Tanzania, and you guys could just do a quick assessment on that and say, well, if you go ahead with this, you're not going to get a D, you're going to get an F, and your pension just went up in smoke. Yeah,
absolutely.
It'll be an interesting one because that whole feedback mechanism really, because it was seen to be a form of cultural imperialism, as you know, in Tanzania, in particular in the case of that road, it nearly backfired on some very, very powerful organizations who had the temerity to stand up and say to the Tanzanian government, you cannot do this. And the Tanzanian government said, hold my beer and watch me do it, because it then became an issue of national pride. So it'd be interesting. You'd have to find a way to square that circle, I think, to a certain extent.
Well, yeah, I mean, it needs to be an African organization, so that this is not like it's being funded by Westerners who have some sort of agenda, and I don't know whether we would be able to base this thing at the university in Kigali. It would be great publicity for the institution. As a home-bred African institution, we set up a monitoring system.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we have the tools. The satellite technology gets better every year. We have the internet and online GIS tools. We've got all the tools to pull this together. A lot of it can be done remotely. Of course, we'd have to go in on the ground to look at certain parameters and do verification, but the tools are available to do it, that's for sure.
That's really fascinating. Now, you touched on something that I think is quite pertinent here, and we were off camera beforehand discussing this and saying, that one of the greatest threats to conservation on the African continent is poorly informed, well-intentioned people who want to get involved and want to help, but actually are kind of coming from an emotional point of view rather than a factual, scientific, very pragmatic point of view, which, as you and I know, since we live on the continent, there's a lot of poor people, and at the end of the day, the power is with the politicians, and they are responsible to their electorate, so squaring that circle is not going to be done with emotion. It's got to be pragmatic. It's got to be something that actually works on the ground. you know, and some of your kind of more controversial ideas about farming animals as being a way out of the trap, often run foul of those folk. But I just wonder, you know, where do you come down on that sort of scale of things? That there's folk who are well-intentioned, but emotionally kind of caught up in the whole thing. How do we cut through that, in your opinion?
It's a difficult one. You know, people are motivated by, you know, a set of ideas and ideology around, you know, how wildlife should live and should exist. I find it a bit disturbing that, you know, people in America and Europe should have strong opinions about how Africans manage their wildlife, when we don't really have strong opinions about how they manage their bears and their moose and their elk. But, you know, that's a historical problem. You know, my argument is to listen to people who live with wildlife. So, for example, in Zambia, where most of my experience is from, people hate wildlife. That's not too strong a way to say it. The rural people want it gone. They're not interested. Go to Namibia, and people love wildlife because they own it. So it's about tenure, you know, the issue of tenure. Who has tenure over this resource? Well, if the government or the president owns all the wildlife, you're not allowed to do anything to it. You can't make any money out of it. It comes and eats all your crops and kills your livestock. Well, then, you know, why would people want it around?
Yeah, and
where people have tenure over the animals, they are able to, you know, set up conservancies like they have done in huge areas in Namibia.
Yeah.
And, you know, Namibia is a revolution in terms of the number of, you know, wildlife on the land in the last 20, 30 years. So,
and the thing about it,
that huge emotion needs to be tempered by listening to the people on the ground.
Yeah, and the thing about it is that model that you have in Zambia is not a Zambian model; it's a British model.
Correct.
You know, it's a legacy of the colonial period, and you have the same model in Kenya and the same model in Tanzania, and the same model in Zambia and in Malawi. And you're right, it's failing, and the kind of exception that proves the rule for me is Zimbabwe, because post-independence they looked at this and in fact, they were the originators of the model of private ownership. They did it before the South Africans and the Namibians. And that was guys who were...
Yeah, unfortunately, you know, Zimbabwe did a great job of that. Unfortunately, they didn't extend that to rural communities. And so while, you know, private landowners were able to own their wildlife, you know, the ownership was extended to an organ of local government called the Rural District Council, which was the actual owner of the wildlife. So they stopped short of devolving it.
So that's a very interesting point, and you're right that is the Achilles heel of the Zimbabwean model, is that rural, where the rural communities are concerned, the government keeps
further.
Yeah, sorry, Mike. I think we were talking over each other again. So go ahead.
Yeah, so the Namibian model went that one step further to actually devolve the ownership right down to the local community level and make it, no matter what politicking goes on at local government level, they have no say whatsoever in how communities manage their wildlife resources. So Zimbabwe was a pioneer for sure, absolutely. But Namibia seems to have taken it to the level where it needed to go in order to be really successful.
That's really interesting. That's really interesting. So what do you see kind of the future of African conservation? If I could give you, Dr. Mike Musgrave, a magic wand to wave, what would you like to see done in the next 10 to 15 years that you think would be have the most profound long-term effect, in your opinion?
I'd like to see African wildlife generating value for its people. And, I work with a hugely dynamic group of young people from the age of sort of 18, 19 to people in their mid-30s. Believe me, the future of Africa and the future of African wildlife is in really good hands. Change is coming. I've never been more optimistic about the future of wildlife in Africa. It's been flagged as a source of wealth, a source of income. And the work we're doing is pushing that agenda very, very hard. Every time we think of wildlife or wild spaces, we think about how to attach value that comes back down to local communities and improves livelihoods. And it's hard. It's not easy. Not suggesting that this is an easy change. And I don't know where it's going to go. But the problem is no one's ever tried. We've been stuck in a model for, since colonial times, basically. And we need to try. We just need to try.
So this is,
fail and try again.
So this is really interesting. Because if you speak to anybody else in conservation, they're all uniformly of the opinion that it's about getting more donor money and more donations in, and more support and more. In other words, their argument is, if we could just get more of what we've already been doing, if we could just do twice as much, if we had twice the amount of money and twice the number of helicopters and goodness knows what else there, then we could stem the tide. And your answer is, the money's there. We just need to unlock the value of it by empowering the people to manage their own resources.
Absolutely. It's about, a lot of it is about legislation and policy. If we could get the right legislation and the right policies in place, we could unlock massive value across the continent. Of course, it needs to be done, in a way that's sustainable, in a way that ensures that we maintain ecosystem function. Because, to me, conservation is not about individual species; it's about maintaining the function of an ecosystem across vast areas, so that it underpins the wealth of the country. But I think, these changes are coming. I get the sense that young people are going to demand these changes. The international community is certainly changing its thinking. And so it's, there's a definite global movement towards placing a monetary value on natural resources. And I think Africa, this can be a subset of that in terms of the policy changes that need to happen to unlock that value.
That is fantastic. So guys, at the end of this video, I'll include in the notes below, there'll be a link so that you can look up Dr. Mike Musgrave. You can see his work and follow his blog, which is very interesting. I'd recommend that you all sign up to follow him. And he's also a enthusiastic Twitterer. And his stuff is always well worth reading. It's usually quite pithy and to the point, and I always get a good laugh when I read Mike's bringing people back to earth with the bump. But Mike, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute privilege to have you on, and I wish you all the best. And if you ever do get to Kigali, let me know when you're going to be there, and I'll have to come and look you up. Thanks for joining us, Mike.
Thanks, Russell. Been good chatting to you, and great to have the opportunity to talk about some controversial stuff.
Guys, that's it for the show this week. Thanks very much for joining us. Next week, as promised, I will have Buzz Charlton on. Charlton McCullum Safaris. He's a professional hunting operator from Zimbabwe. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about the challenges that they face at the coalface, which is where he's at. So until that time, I hope that you all stay happy and healthy. And I look forward to talking to you again next week. Goodbye.